Good afternoon and welcome to Border Report Live. We are coming to you from the valleycentral.com digital desk here in South Texas for today's edition. My name is Rudy Mireles, and joining me today is Border Report South Texas correspondent Sandra Sanchez. Good afternoon, Sandra. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Rudy?
Good, good. Later on today, we're going to hear from Texas Department of Public Safety spokesperson Lieutenant Christopher Olivares about the border security efforts from the state here along the border. But first, let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on in the headlines, specifically 2,000 miles to the west of us in Los Angeles. Our partners at The Hill are reporting that the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, was butting heads with members of Congress over the cost of the president's use of troops in LA to respond to protests this morning. Now, President Donald Trump has activated about 4,000 National Guard troops this week. Hundreds of them, actually Marines, arrived in Los Angeles overnight, despite objections from California Governor Gavin Newsom and other local leaders, including the LAPD chief, who said the deployment is actually making things harder for his officers when it comes to logistics. Now, so far, LA Mayor Karen Bass says over 100 people were arrested Monday night alone, but that the protests were mostly peaceful until the evening hours. And again, on Monday, the president took to Truth Social to say to protesters, quote, "If they spit, we will hit, and I promise you they will be hit harder than they have ever been hit before," end quote. Also happening on Monday, Governor Newsom and the state's Attorney General Rob Bonta have sued the Trump administration over the unilateral National Guard deployment. We're going to keep you updated as everything out there develops over the coming days. Now, here over on this side of the border in the Rio Grande Valley, we are seeing a surge of small business owners looking for employees as Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers raid businesses across the Rio Grande Valley. And you can see these businesses here in Harlingen, Texas, empty parking lots, closed signs, the shutters on that taqueria down right there. And that's happening in Harlingen, San Benito, all the way to Brownsville. Now, we did speak to owners at one restaurant where they say it was chaos when the ICE agents walked in and started arresting employees. Now, next door to that, a beauty salon owner said the ICE raids are affecting people like her and the people who she says are hardworking people and not criminals. The mayor of Harlingen, Norma Sepulveda, is also an immigration attorney who says small businesses are concerned and that the federal agents have not made any attempt to work with or coordinate with the city on these raids, saying, quote, or in part rather, surprise actions without local notice or clarity erode public trust. Now, there are reports that more than 20,000 National Guard troops nationwide are being requested by the Trump administration to be used in immigration enforcement activities, including during night and rural interdiction operations, as well as guard duty and riot control inside detention facilities. 10,000 troops will be needed to support transportation operations, including movement of suspected illegal immigrants and children, and that is coming from reporting at NPR, as well as Stars and Stripes, a military-centric newspaper for service members across the globe. They didn't know yet, according to, the Army Secretary Dan Driscoll last week told the Senate committee that he did not yet know what role National Guard troops would play in the immigration enforcement effort, but did say that troop involvement would be legal and in line with training. Sandra?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in here. Senate Democrat Jack Reed of Rhode Island told the Senate Arms Committee that the request is unprecedented in mission and scope and would be the first time that National Guard would be used to enforce an immigration crackdown within the United States. But as we all know, here on the border, South Texas, West Texas, we have had National Guard on our border. They have been part of border security since 2021 when Governor Abbott implemented Operation Lone Star. So just wanted to say that thousands are stationed here and patrol from the Gulf to West Texas. So that statement, he said, really isn't true. We are part of the United States. They definitely are here, and they're part of a mission.
Yeah, we see them driving all over the place every day, all around the Rio Grande Valley, from Brownsville up to Rio Grande City. So definitely not anything new for us. But, you did mention some of the operational support. And just as a reminder for folks at home, after the break, we're not going to break yet. We got a little more to talk about. But after the break, we are going to be speaking to Texas Department of Public Safety spokesperson, Lieutenant Christopher Olivares, about the state-specific mission down here on the border. But first, there has been legislation filed to help law enforcement to keep them safe. Sandra, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. Republican Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn has introduced the Protecting Law Enforcement from Doxing Act. That would make it illegal to publish private information on federal law enforcement officials who are involved in a criminal complaint or immigration enforcement event. That is follows the release of private information by Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell of Tennessee. Highway patrolman of a Tennessee highway patrolman who helped to arrest an ICE suspect. Immigrants believed that was believed to be in the country illegally. Nearly 200 people were arrested and 95 had prior criminal convictions and pending criminal charges. 31 were previously removed from the United States. The Department of Homeland Security says under this bill, if passed, anyone who, quote, publicly identifies federal immigration officers with the alleged intent to obstruct enforcement could face a fine and up to 5 years in prison.
Yeah, and there's some pretty alarming statistics coming from the Department of Homeland Security regarding this bill. We often say, why do we need another law? Why does there need to be another bill? Well, according to DHS, attacks on ICE officers have increased by more than 400%. And speaking of that, that's one of the things that we're going to talk about with Lieutenant Christopher Olivares of the Texas Department of Public Safety this afternoon. And we're going to check in with him in just a little bit. So make sure to stay with us because after the break, we'll have him. We'll talk about this and everything that's going on as we cross into year 3 of Operation Lone Star actions here in the Rio Grande Valley. So stick around. You're watching Border Report live on Next Star Nation. Of Public Safety to talk to us today about everything that is going on over the last couple years here on the Texas border. Thanks so much for joining us today, Lieutenant.
Hey, great to be with you, Rudy and Sandra.
Thank you so much. Let's just start with, Lieutenant, how things have evolved for state troopers over the last few years when it comes to this mission.
Well, a lot has changed, obviously, in the last, even the last over 100 days. But I want to go back when Operation Lone Star was first implemented in 2021, when Governor Abbott launched this operation involving DPS state troopers and National Guard on the border because of the influx or the surge that we were seeing of mass migration along the Texas-Mexico border. But at that particular time, there were so many events that were happening across the border. We look back in 2021, the situation in Del Rio, Texas with the Haitians. And then you go to Brownsville, Texas, beating up the Title 42 back in 2023. And also we go past Texas. That was the epicenter of what we were seeing in terms of people crossing the border illegally between the ports of entry. And of course, at that time, we were averaging anywhere from between 10 to sometimes 15,000 illegal crossings a day across the entire southwest border. Now we go into 2024 early on, and because of the efforts and because of what Governor Abbott had put in place over the last 4 years with Operation Lone Star, and the fact that National Guard soldiers have been constructing infrastructure barriers along the border, along the river, to try to deter and stop some of these illegal border crosses from taking place, and also the construction of the border wall. That in itself, in that year alone, we were able to get illegal border crossings down by 87%. And of course, even during that time, border crossings dropped. We were averaging anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 a day across the southwest border. Now we fast forward, to the new administration, and again, from one day to the next, we saw a significant change in legal border crossing. We saw a significant reduction from, as I mentioned, 1,500 to 2,000 a day, to where we're only averaging 200 to 300 a day across the entire southwest border. So there's been a huge change on the border. Of course, that does alleviate some of that strain that some of our federal partners were feeling over the last 4 years, because they were constantly processing the surge of illegal immigrants that were coming across the border between the ports of entry. And now we can focus more on criminal work. And of course, that was always the focus and the goal of Operation Lone Star, was to focus on criminal work, because at that particular time, you had Border Patrol agents, ICE agents, DEA, all federal agents or all federal partners were tied up due to the influx of people coming across the border illegally. So what that does, obviously, that allows the criminal element, the cartels and criminal gangs and even domestic gangs in the United States to take full advantage of that. That's why we saw a surge in human smuggling, drug smuggling, that was happening across the border. So now we can focus more on that criminal work, interdiction, focus more on seizing money, weapons that are going into Mexico, drugs as well, and also human smuggling. That's something that we still deal with along the border. It has not been consistent like it was the last 4 years, because there's less people coming across, but we still deal with human smuggling, also focusing on criminal gangs that are in the country right now that we need to locate. We have our own people, as far as what I mean by that is people that have committed crimes in Texas that are here illegally. We're also working with our federal partners, with ICE, ERO, Border Patrol, to try to locate those criminals, get them arrested, and get them removed as well. So the operation has transitioned to where it was when we first started early on, dealing with the surge at the border, now focusing more on that criminal element and doing more criminal work and working with our federal partners.
Lieutenant, you mentioned early on some of the responsibilities. I remember when state troopers were mostly used to inspect trucks at ports of entry. There was really no arresting power. That has all changed with some of the powers that Governor Abbott has allowed the state troopers. How has that affected what you do, and how has that helped, say, recruit people to want to come be part of this effort?
Well, I mean, we constantly have, DPS academies. In fact, just through the legislature, we actually got approved for over 400 positions, new trooper positions that we need to hire in the next several years. So we're going to have more DPS academies, more recruiting efforts. But I think Operation Lone Star really shed a light on what DPS actually does, beyond traffic enforcement and crash investigation, what typically people know state troopers for. I think it really evolved in what our roles actually did during Operation Lone Star and what we're still doing right now. We have done so much. Our state troopers have done so much over the years. Our men and women, our investigators, our Texas Rangers, our pilots, our boat operators, everything that we've been able to contribute to this operation, I think it really has shed light that DPS, has really evolved over the years, and that we're doing so much more now, not only on the border, but it could be anything else that's happening in the state. It could be civil unrest. It can be actually what's happening right now in LA, and of course we had our own protest yesterday in Austin and also in Dallas. So
dealing with those type of situations, natural disasters, but of course the border situation really, put a spotlight on Texas and put a spotlight on DPS.
Because we were at the forefront of, excuse me, and we still remain at the forefront right now with this current border situation.
You mentioned protests in Austin. Let's talk about, at the top of the show, we talked about Los Angeles, the events, the protests that are happening there. From a law enforcement perspective, is this being handled right? Do you have any suggestions? And what kind of preparations are being done to protect events like that from happening here in the Rio Grande Valley or elsewhere on the border?
Well, look, I think, first off, that's what makes our country is that people have the right to protest, based on the First Amendment. That is the fabric of our nation. And people have the right to, dispute or voice their concerns, or debate for that matter, right? If they don't agree with something. But of course, doing it peacefully, lawfully is the most important thing. And I think what we're seeing right now, what transpired over the weekend in LA, is anything but that. I'm sure you had protesters that were there for a vested interest in immigration, that were there to peacefully protest. But then you have those agitators, those opportunists that are there taking advantage of a situation to actually assault law enforcement, to have an all-out assault on law enforcement. And I think what's happening right now in LA, the fact is that, yes, people want to voice their concerns about immigration, but when you have violence and you have vandalism and damage to property, their message is getting lost right now, and there's not going to be any effective change. If people really want to have change, that's the border situation or immigration for that matter, they need to talk to the lawmakers, Congress. I mean, those are the people, those are the elected officials that are going to be able to actually affect change. But again, let's go back to what's happening right now in LA, and I can tell you in Texas, we've had our own situations over the years, whether it be at our Capitol, and of course yesterday, as you mentioned, Sandra, in Austin, Texas, and as well as Dallas, we had protests there, but they were controlled. You had some that were trying to agitate law enforcement, but we did make some arrests, and actually we were able to contain and control those cities before they got out of hand, and there was no type of destruction or damage that we're seeing right now in LA, where you have cars that are being burned. And really the business owners, the small business owners, they're the ones that are being impacted right now, especially when it comes to vandalism. So we're well prepared. We know we have some more potential protests that are coming, especially this weekend. So we're well prepared. We have soldiers on the border. We have plenty of troopers. And we have a close relationship with our local, county, and state law enforcement partners. So we're ready. But again, message is obviously, right? Yes, protest, do it peacefully, get your voice out, get your concerns out. But when you use violence, your message is going to get lost.
This will date me, but in 1992, I actually covered the Los Angeles riots for USA Today, and I can tell you, I know firsthand on the streets what it's like to be pepper sprayed and how violent it can be and how scary it can be. So I understand what you're talking about. Rudy, I think we were going to
we're going to just go to a quick break. We're going to talk to Lieutenant Christopher Olivares more about what Texas state troopers are seeing along the southern border. So stay with us as we continue the conversation in just, let me check the time here, in about a minute. We'll talk to you in just a moment. You're watching Border Report Live. And welcome back to Border Report Live. We are speaking with Lieutenant Christopher Olivares, who's talking to us about the Texas DPS role here on the southern border and how it's changed over the last couple of years. And we're also joined by South Texas border correspondent Sandra Sanchez. Sandra, take it away.
Well, actually, we were talking a bit about some of the changes that were happening with the Operation Lone Star. Lieutenant Olivares, the cost has exceeded $11 billion over the past 3 years. Is there any talk of scaling back now that, as you mentioned, a lot of border crossings have diminished significantly? And there has been criticism by some people that do we need such a force on the border? What's your opinion, sir?
Well, Senator, I think that, and again, going back to the last 4 years and what we experienced, just in terms of the mass migration and the fact that we had so many people coming across the border, and those that were voluntarily turning themselves in to claim asylum, but also on top of that, you have that criminal element, you have the gotaways, unknown gotaways, suspected terrorists, gangs that were coming across the border as well, that were exploiting those vulnerabilities along the border. Operation Lone Star played a key role, a critical role, in actually trying to deter and stop some of that activity. And I think it's a very critical right now and very imperative right now that we maintain our posture on the border because, again, for one, right now, what's happening right now across the country, there's not enough ICE agents, there's not enough Border Patrol agents, and of course, we're still waiting to see what's going to happen in Congress. If they're actually going to pass funding, or actually, sorry, not Congress, but the Senate, to see if they're actually going to pass funding for more Border Patrol agents, more ICE agents, more border wall construction. So in the interim, we have to maintain our posture on the border. The fact is, we can't get complacent just because numbers are down in terms of illegal border crossings. We're still working on other investigations. We're still trying to target smuggling organizations, drug organizations as well. So those are things that we're still dealing with on the border. So in terms of the cost, I always say, what really can't put a price on public safety. I mean, the fact is that we need to have the manpower on the border. That includes troopers and soldiers to maintain that presence. It's a deterrent. And not only that, but we're actually protecting our communities, we're protecting our state and the country for that matter, because we are the first line of defense. So I think, Governor Abbott has made it very clear is that our posture is not going to change until the federal government's able to really get back to where they were before, have all the infrastructure, have all the manpower to actually carry out their agenda. And if there is a change, obviously the governor will make that announcement. In the interim, we're going to continue making those. We're going to continue moving forward as far as with Operation Lone Star and maintain that posture on the border and focus more on those criminal threats.
You mentioned the border wall, and I wanted to reference exactly where you're standing here on the border wall. In the Senate bill that they're currently considering would include $46 billion for border wall expansion across the southwest border. How important is the border barrier to stop people from coming across? What is the role it actually plays?
That's a good question, Sandra. Obviously, there's been so much, criticism about the border wall from both sides, right? Different people that have a different perspective on that. But the way I say it is, and I tell it from an actual law enforcement perspective, by spending majority of my time out in the field, working with our troopers, working with our soldiers, working with Border Patrol agents, and I see the effectiveness of having a barrier along the border. It does slow down activity. And even right now, we're still dealing with people that come across that are trying to evade capture and trying to get away. And they actually try to scale the border wall. That's why it's so important to have a barrier there. It does slow them down. We can actually deploy resources to actually make those apprehensions, make those arrests. It does close the gaps and vulnerabilities along the border where you may not be able to place a soldier or have some type of law enforcement presence. So it is effective in terms of trying to deter illegal crossings or any type of criminal activity, drug smuggling. But I would say, though, in my opinion, the most effective tool was the actual water buoys that Governor Abbott actually placed in Eagle Pass, Texas. Because I say that because that's the first line of defense. When people see a barrier in the middle of the river, they're not going to want to cross there. They're going to go somewhere else. And of course, that's less cost effective. And actually is more effective as well, because again, that's right in the middle of the river. But when people see that, it's going to save lives. They're not going to want to cross the river. You're going to prevent drownings. You're going to prevent children from drowning. So both factors are good as far as a border wall and as well as those water buoys. And from what I understand, I know the chief of the Border Patrol, Mike Banks, has considered actually, carrying out that operation as far as with the water buoys and placing more along the Rio Grande. So
that's what I've heard.
That's why it goes back to what you said earlier, by maintaining that posture on the border until we can get some of that infrastructure in place.
Do you know exactly where those would be expanded to? And also, I've been to Eagle Pass a number of times and seen the buoys myself. They're 1,000 feet long and it cost $1 million. So critics say it really isn't cost effective. It's also on the U.S. side kind of mired more in mud because it needed to move more towards our direction, right? There was a problem with having it more centered in the river. People say, and I have seen migrants walk around it, you say it's effective.
Well, it's effective, especially in Eagle Pass, because that particular area where the water buoys were placed, that was one of the known crossing areas where we saw a high volume of people crossing that border onto a pecan farm ranch. And since we were able to place those buoys in that area, obviously people did go around it because obviously the buoys are not placed along the entire Rio Grande. That would be ideal to have that. But of course, we were able to actually have more resources in those areas where we didn't have those water buoys. And of course, again, we also had infrastructure. We had the concertina wire. We had the fencing that was placed by National Guard engineers. That was also effective as well. So with the water buoys being the first line barrier, and then you have concertina wire and fencing, and then the border wall, that's a force multiplier in trying to prevent illegal border crossings, try to deter people from actually crossing the river. That was probably one of the biggest concerns and probably frustrations, was that trying to get people not to cross the river, especially in Eagle Pass. We had a record number of drownings, especially children. Nothing. There's nothing that's more impactful, especially for our men and women, having to pull a child out of the river that drowned. And that's something that our men and women have done, especially our boat operators that actually had seen that and experienced that. So that's why I really argue the fact that infrastructure is so important when you can try to prevent anybody from crossing a river or a desert, depending on what part of the border, and actually go to an area where it's safe, where it's humane, where you can actually claim asylum, and of course let the federal authorities then do their process.
You mentioned new ways that you all are trying to stop people from crossing. We had Sister Norma Pimentel recently, Executive Director, Catholic Charities, Rio Grande Valley. I know that you know her. And she was talking that immigrants who cross and try to claim asylum because they fear for their lives in their home countries should be allowed to do so. I think we have a clip of something that she said, Rudy, to us very recently. Can we play that?
They're not criminals, they're people, families who are basically asking for protection and safety, and a detention is more like a prison. And I think a family, a child, a mother should not be under those conditions. I think we're better than that. Our country stands for higher principles and values that don't reflect that as who we are, and we should treat people.
So what's your opinion? I mean, is there a place for humanitarian parole here on the southwest border?
Well, obviously, humanitarian parole, that's going to be a decision, from the federal government. What I can tell you, though, just, based on what the sister said, I always said this the last 4 years, because as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time on the border, and I saw it for myself, and I experienced it for myself, and I was out there, actually when people were coming across, and children. And I've always argued, no matter what your political views are and how you feel about the border, there is nothing humane about allowing people to cross a river, especially a child, or even to pay a criminal in Mexico to get across that river. Every person that came across that river had to pay a fee, whether you're an adult or a child, to the cartels or to these smuggling organizations. And there's no telling what these children endured, from their journey, especially unaccompanied children. That's why I say to all those critics that were criticizing Texas for what we were doing, no one was out there on the front lines, as far as, anybody that was being very critical about what we were doing, actually seeing children coming across that border by themselves, that were left along the river's edge. There's nothing humane about that. I think if people really wanted to affect change during that time, and even now, try to help people so they don't cross the border illegally. That's where I say, these protests, it's very important, very imperative that they get their voices heard. But again, the voices need to be heard to the lawmakers, to Congress, to actually have laws in place where you can have immigrants come over lawfully in a more humane way, where you don't have to have someone crossing the river or a desert or paying a criminal or to get smuggled in the car. Operation Lone Star, the last 4 years, Sandra, when we talked about children, we have rescued over 900 children that were either left abandoned along the river or being smuggled in cars. And I shared plenty of those videos on social media showing that. So I go back to what's humane. Well, there's nothing humane about allowing people to cross a river and actually risk their lives. Yes, they're desperate. They want a better life, and we completely understand that. But there should have been a better process during that time to actually save lives and to help these people get across, but in a lawful way.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lieutenant Olivares. We appreciate you spending your time with us today, but that is all the time we have. So again, thank you. We appreciate you coming on, sir.
Thank you both.
All right, and you can get more of all the things we talked about today on borderreport.com. Sandra, the rest of this team of incredibly seasoned, award-heavy journalists on the border are working constantly to keep you up to date on everything along these 2,000 miles, so make sure to check it out. My name is Rudy Mireles, coming to you live from the Valley Central Digital Desk in Deep South Texas. Until Thursday, have a good day.